Introduction. The desert does not forgive weakness. It breathes heat, tears the earth with cracks, and swallows up sounds, leaving only the rustle of the wind. For those who find themselves here, it is as if it is slowly bringing their sentence closer. Daniel and Margaret, who love each other to the point of goosebumps, faced this judgment at the sunset of their long journey. It wasn't just a road trip, it was a chance to salvage what was barely hanging on by a thin thread of trust. History. Their marriage, once so vibrant and inspiring, had wilted like leaves in the cold. Margaret, with her love of detail, knew that if things didn't change, it was over. Daniel, on the other hand, was reaching for the past like a child reaching for a balloon that had already flown away. The decision to take a trip across the Arizona desert came out of the blue. If this trip doesn't save us, then what will? Margaret whispered quietly in the car, her words drowned out by the roar of the engine. Daniel remained silent, but gripped the steering wheel tighter. It was their last if. Part 1. Silence. The morning was strangely quiet. The wind, which usually raises dusty clouds, seemed to have disappeared. The sand dunes on the horizon seemed frozen. "Are you sure you made the right turn?" Margaret leaned forward a little, looking at the navigator. "The map shows straight ahead." "What are you afraid of?" Daniel tried to sound confident, but his voice shook. The road disappeared before they realized it. Now all that surrounded them was the vast desert with its silent threats. "This is bad." She looked at her husband, her eyes searching for support. "Come on, Mark. It's just sand." He grinned nervously. "We'll be back on the highway in a couple miles." But a couple miles didn't happen. The car froze, stalled, as if its heart had failed too. Part 2. Time is running out. "What the hell?" Daniel stepped out, slamming the door shut. The heat came at him with such force that he involuntarily covered his eyes with his hand. Margaret stayed in the car. Her gaze wandered over the gauges, but all the hands were looking at 0. "This isn't just an accident, Dan." "I can feel that," she began as he slammed on the hood. "Don't start, Mark." "The car broke down, that's all." He spoke as if he wanted to convince himself. But an hour later, when the sun began to burn mercilessly, they were no longer arguing. The only water they had taken had run out. "I think someone was here," Margaret whispered suddenly, pointing at the strange footprints. "Are you serious?" Daniel looked up, but felt cold despite the blazing sun. The tracks led to the nearest barcan, as if inviting them to continue on foot. Part 3. Ghosts of the Past. As they began to walk, the desert seemed to come alive. The barcans moved, the air shook. "Do you hear that?" Margaret asked, grasping Daniel's hand. "It's just the wind," his voice sounded uncertain. But she heard differently. Voices. Muffled, as if from somewhere underground. "Why are you here?" "You're lost." Daniel turned around at her startled look, but didn't say anything. Something like panic was beginning to boil up inside him. As they reached the barcan, they saw a strange structure. Half submerged in the sand was a building that looked like an ancient temple. "Can you see it?" she whispered. He nodded, but didn't dare come any closer. "Can't we just walk around this place?" Daniel tried to smile, but his heart clenched at the sense of impending terror. Margaret, as if hypnotized, took a step forward. "No. We have to find out." Part 4. Shadows at the door. Margaret walked forward as if in a trance, ignoring Daniel's weak protests. The sand beneath their feet became firmer and the air cooler. As they came closer, they saw strange symbols on the walls of the building. Their shape was strangely disturbing, lines intertwined in patterns that seemed both chaotic and deliberate. Was this ancient? Or am I going crazy? Daniel muttered, looking at the symbols. I don't know. But it doesn't look like something someone left by accident, Margaret said, touching one of the walls with her hand. Suddenly there was a thud from deep inside the building, a heavy sound, like the creaking of a giant door. They froze, looking at each other. We shouldn't, Daniel began, but his voice was drowned out by a strange echo. We have to find out what's in there, Margaret interrupted. Her voice was a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. She stepped inside. The floor was uneven, as if chopped by thousands of claws. The sounds of their footsteps echoed through the dark corridors. The walls around them seemed to breathe, they seemed to pulse slightly, like a living thing. Why does this place seem so wrong? Daniel muttered. Because it wasn't meant for us, a voice answered, but it wasn't Margaret's. Part 5, Echoes of the Lost. Daniel turned around, but there was no one behind them. Just a dark corridor going off into infinity. Did you hear that? He asked in a whisper. No, Margaret answered, but there was fear in her gaze. Then the walls around them began to change their shape. Symbols flashed, emitting a strange, dim light. From the depths of the corridor came a new sound, a whisper, barely audible at first, then louder and louder. You came late. Who is it? Who are you? Daniel shouted, grabbing Margaret's arm. But instead of an answer, he heard his own voice. It was as if his scream echoed off the walls, but came back to him from another reality. Dan, that's enough. We have to keep moving, Margaret said coldly, her face more serious than ever. Further on, they came across a room. A strange room with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. In the center stood a massive stone table. On it was a mirror, covered in cracks but still reflecting light. Margaret stepped closer, as if mesmerized. Don't look in it. Daniel shouted, but it was too late. She saw her reflection, but instead of her, there was another woman standing in the mirror. Her face was almost the same, but distorted, lips stretched in a sinister smile, eyes black as night. That's not me, Margaret whispered, but her reflection laughed. Part 6, Revelations. We have to leave. Now. Daniel grabbed Margaret's shoulder, snapping her out of her trance. But the mirror began to crack. It flashed with a strange light, illuminating the room. From its depths came a new voice, louder and more commanding. You don't belong here. The light went out, and they were in darkness. Daniel felt the walls of the room begin to narrow. The sound of stone moving against stone echoed in his head. Daniel, Margaret said, her voice quiet, almost dead. What? Now what? He turned back to her. But her face was different. She looked exactly like the woman in the mirror. You've been running from the truth for too long now, she said, her voice sounding strangely dual, as if someone else was speaking. This isn't you. Who are you? He shouted, stepping back. I'm what you've been trying to forget, she replied. The thing that brought us here. Daniel suddenly realized that the darkness around him had begun to change. Now he was standing in the sand, surrounded by a vast desert, but Margaret was gone. Part 7, Epilogue. Daniel stood looking around. The Barkhaunts looked like huge creatures watching him. Suddenly Margaret reappeared in front of him. Don't you get it? She asked, her voice strangely familiar but empty. You're not real. You're just an illusion, he muttered. She smiled and disappeared, leaving only a whisper behind her. No one leaves this place. Daniel realized he was standing by the car again. It was in its place, safe and sound. Just a dream, he breathed, but something inside him knew the truth: this dream would never end. Conclusion. Daniel and Margaret's story is not just a grim tale of survival in the wilderness or confronting the inexplicable. It is a metaphor that reveals man's deepest fears about himself and the inevitability of facing his inner demons. The desert in this story is a symbol of isolation, emotional exhaustion, and the emptiness that engulfs us when we lose touch with ourselves and others. For Daniel and Margaret, this journey began as an attempt to save their relationship, but instead of working together, they found themselves captive to their own illusions, fears, and refusal to recognize the truth. Margaret, consumed by her desire to find meaning and reclaim what she had lost, didn't notice how she became a victim of her own internal conflict. Her reflection in the mirror is the embodiment of her fear of losing herself, of changing beyond recognition. For her, the desert became a test of her willingness to face the truth, that relationships are not saved by external actions if there is no sincerity and trust inside. Daniel, in turn, symbolizes resistance to change. He was always trying to control the situation by denying the obvious. His struggle with the reality around him became a struggle with himself. His constant attempts to hide behind rationalizations, "It's just sand, it's just wind," deprived him of the ability to listen to himself and understand that the scary thing is not outside, but inside. The key moment comes in the final scene, where Daniel walks back to the car and everything looks normal. But this is not a relief, but a terrible truth. He is trapped in his own mind, trapped in memories, trapped in a part of himself that he never dared to let go of. It is a symbol of how we can be our own worst jailers if we refuse to change, accept responsibility for mistakes, and be honest with ourselves. In the finale, the main lesson remains: each of us is responsible for getting out of our own personal wilderness. Sometimes this requires not only courage, but also the ability to let go of what no longer serves us.